All right, Momoko, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to share your story with the listeners and understand more about what's brought you here and how you've been able to navigate life, considering some of the things that you've also experienced and gone through. So, before we jump into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself with the listeners and what's brought you here and what your story is all about.
Firstly, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's always nice to meet new people. So, my memoir is about my experience going through hotel quarantine. So, it was a 2 week experience in Australia when Australia was during the height of the pandemic, and where
Mhm.
you had to go through, it was like a solitary confinement experience where you are put into a hotel room by yourself. The windows are bolted shut. You have a guard outside your door, and you have to stay there basically until they deem that you're healthy enough to leave and go back into the world. And during that time,
Mm.
I actually almost died. And then I was going back to Australia. Nobody really goes back to Australia. Went back to Australia during that time if they didn't have to, but my mother was dying. So I went to see her.
Mm.
And so my memoirs about that, she actually sadly passed away during that 2 week period when I was in during the hotel quarantine. So that's my memoir. So that's
Mhm.
this obviously a ton of adversity. I actually started as a comedy writer, so despite the fact that it's tragic and it's sad, I try to throw in as many jokes as I can whenever appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is quite this complicated story there in terms of what's happened, but you're trying to make light of it, as you said, with humor, which can play a part. Now, help us understand a little bit in terms of because you're also in the
Yes.
medicine world. What allowed you to get there? Because you also had to immigrate very early, right? And start with nothing, essentially. I think there's something to be said about your ability to overcome adversity, but it didn't just start with that
Correct.
quarantine period. It's something you've also had to experience
Yes.
early in life. So, how did that shape your experience then? So, I'm just trying to understand what's allowed you to overcome all these obstacles in
That's a
life.
very good question. I think that so I actually moved from Australia to China to go to medical school, and my undergraduate degree is actually in Chinese language studies because I had to learn Chinese first before I went to medical school. And there's a rather strange aspect of my personality that seems to like challenges. I don't know if that's good or bad, but
Yeah.
yeah, so I chose a
But
that in itself is a particularly challenging path, but I felt like my soul was called to do that. And my whole life
mm,
feels, I don't know if it's conscious or subconscious or something else that pulls me towards, unwittingly, towards challenging situations where I somehow land on my feet. Not always very quickly. There's a whole lot of
mm,
crawling that happens before I stand.
yeah, fair enough. But why did you choose China of all places, knowing that you would have to learn the language and it's not something you couldn't just jump into med school right away?
So I pursue a degree in integrative medicine. So it was pharmaceuticals, drug therapy,
Hmm.
and Chinese herbal medicine fused together and trying to
Mm,
find and discover new ways of treating challenging medical conditions. So I was very drawn to that. My mother introduced me to alternative
mhm,
medicine at a young age. She was quite ill, and I think that watching her suffer from a young age was probably one of the main reasons why I went into the medical field.
mhm. Okay. And what were some of the things you learned about yourself as you were, as you said, you're drawn to challenging life situations, or those are the situations that just happen to you? What's allowed you to navigate these situations? And as you said, it's not always that you land on your feet. There's a bit of a period where there is crawling. So that still to me sounds like you're making progress. You're still moving, right? Whereas a lot of the times when people are encountering difficult situations, they just become stagnant and it's hard for them to move forward. So even in that crawling, what is going through your mind to keep going at it and continue to make forward
I mean, to be
progress?
honest, there are times where I'm probably digging a hole deeper into the ground. You know what I mean? Like it's not
Yeah.
really very productive. So just want to be brutally honest about that.
Mhm.
There are times when I'm pretty stagnant too. But as soon as I recognize that I'm
Mhm.
stagnant, then I try to crawl myself out of it. It's not as quickly as possible because sometimes it's hard, depending on, especially if because I seem to dig holes pretty quickly. So sometimes I'm quite far down the
Yeah.
hole and I have to crawl back out before I can then crawl forward. It's a good
Mhm.
question. What is it that makes me want to continue moving forward? I think it's just the recognition that in order for us to grow, because I'm very much focused on growth. And I think that's just the way my brain works, that in terms of like my personal reward center and like feeling better about myself, it's very much wired about personal growth. Does that make sense? I want to be a better
Mhm.
person. I want to grow. I want to
Yeah.
learn things. I think that's what keeps me moving
Yeah.
forward.
And it sounds like that's what you've learned about yourself. So then going back to what you shared during that quarantine period, and unfortunately losing your mother while you were in that phase or period where you couldn't do anything, what were some of those things that you've learned about yourself that allowed you to navigate that whole situation? Because that could be very debilitating for people too, right? And there could be resentment, there could be anger that comes from it because obviously you were, to me, it sounds a bit extreme in terms how that quarantine period was
Oh,
being handled.
extremely. It's very extreme. I went
Yeah.
through a whole situation where I was angry at the
Mhm.
Australian government for what they did to people. And that's not nice. And it's pretty
Mhm.
extreme to put somebody
Yeah.
into a hotel room and bolt the windows shut and have somebody standing outside your door. That's We just don't do that here in America.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
government tried. I think American people would be pretty upset about it, but Australians
Mhm.
not so much. It's,
Yeah.
there are a lot of countries that kind of just follow. They do what the government tells them to do, right, out of fear or for whatever reason. No, so I had to
Yeah.
process that. That in itself, just being angry at the situation, took me a really long time to get over that. The whole thing, like
Mm.
processing it, took. 'Cause I wrote a book which was really helpful because that was the way I really processed. I wrote the book for myself, for my own healing purposes, and then just decided to publish it. Like, why not? And but that
Mhm.
took more than a year to process all of that stuff and just getting all the different emotions because I had to stuff a lot of my feelings when I was in quarantine because I couldn't process as well as there. There was nobody really there for me to
Mm.
that could talk to people over the phone, but I was also so exhausted because I was also very ill too. So a lot of it got
Mm.
suppressed, and I was only able to process it, I would say, months later. Because with grief, I'm sure it can be really exhausting, right? Like just the whole traumatic experience of losing somebody like that. And so I spent months being exhausted and sleeping. I would say like maybe 4 or 5 months where I would just fall asleep. I just collapsed from the exhaustion. Like I thought I was fine, and then I had 5 minutes to get into bed because I knew I was like shutting power was going down and I was going to fall asleep basically. So that went on for months on
Mhm.
end, and during that time where I was exhausted, there wasn't a whole lot of processing that happened during that time, and I knew that I had to get through and rebuild my strength, fill back my tank a little bit before I could even process. I often tell people when they're going through a grief process or something really challenging, you have to wait until you have some energy before you can even start processing. So that's something that
Yeah.
I've seen that a little bit in different areas of my life in the past, but that was really extreme. where I thought, oh wow, like there's not a whole
Mhm.
lot. This is another experience of me being in a hole and just getting. I was just stuck there for quite some time,
Yeah.
and I knew I couldn't get
Mhm.
out of it because I didn't even have the energy to crawl out. Yeah, so I had to be really patient with myself during the time.
Yeah, and you mentioned that on top of that patience, you almost died
Yeah.
yourself, so that was obviously that brings up a lot for people too. So there's a lot of aspects of healing that have needed to take place as you've shared. And one of the things I've come to recognize and learn myself is when you're going through that healing, you're trying to make meaning of your experiences. And sometimes it's obvious, other times it's not. It takes a lot of effort and
Yes.
trial and error to finally understand what's the meaning behind this. But the grief can be tough because you can't just force meaning into any
No.
given situation. And obviously, there was grief with the loss of your mother. So, as far as your healings come along at this point, what kind of meaning have you been able to find from that whole experience, if there's anything that's come
For a
out of
long
it?
time, I thought it was purposeless and meaningless, and I
Hmm.
think the loss itself, it's difficult to find meaning in that. But in terms of living my
Hmm.
life, I realized, wow, it could also be partly because of my age too. That I was entered into my 50s and I just realized that, wow, life is short. And it was so in my face. Oh,
Hmm.
wow, I could have died. My mother did die. And that life was passing by and there were opportunities that I was missing. And I just realized, you know what, I want to commit to living my life more fully. So that's what I got out of that experience, which I think it was good
Hmm.
for me.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Because what I'm hearing then is rather than being stuck in the past or what happened and how terrible it was, how extreme it was, you shifted your focus and you said, I still have a lot of time in front of me. How can I make the most of it? And that's where your
Absolutely.
focus has
And
been.
the rough thing about life is that it's unpredictable. We don't really know how much longer we have on the planet. It could be, who knows? I could live to 150, or I
Yeah.
might be dead in 5 minutes. You don't really know. And
Yeah.
so this was just a reminder to
Right.
myself, let's make the most of whatever it is that I have. And hopefully it's a chunk of time. And if not, I just don't want to die with
Hmm.
regrets. Regrets are awful.
Right.
I've had many
Hmm.
hmm
Hmm.
throughout my life. And I like look back and I was like, oh, I missed that opportunity. Bummer. And I want to feel that less, those regrets.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's also one of the things I've come to realize is what kind of meaning you assign to death itself. So for a lot of people, it's I die and that's
Yeah.
it, it's over. And for other people, it's I die, but maybe I go somewhere else, or there's more beyond that. So it depends on what you ascribe to it. And I think for people, when they're dealing with grief, it really depends on your perspective of death as well that can affect you and can impact your process with grief. If you truly believe this is where it all ends, then yes, that can be very hard to accept. But that's been my experience and understanding, and it does make a difference
Like,
um, in terms of how I deal with death, or even my own how I
oh,
contemplate it.
absolutely. And working with patients, it, a lot of people say, like the atheists often will say to me, they envy people who have spiritual and religious beliefs because it seems to carry them through in a way that atheists really
Mm.
struggle with. And force my personal beliefs because I'm really agnostic. Like I'm really not quite sure. I'd like to think that there's something else. We're talking about
Yeah.
the invisible. It's it's difficult to prove, but I'd like to think that there's else. I hope there is.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the beauty of it, is the idea that you can't prove it. It is invisible because that creates that mystery. And for some people, that is very uncomfortable. I know for people, I'm very some aspects of my life and other aspects I'm not. But I can appreciate why the analytical side can feel discomfort around not knowing what happens and just having some blind faith that there is more. But I agree. Like I have friends that are atheists as well, and they just think that's it, right? And that often does bring about anxiety when it comes to contemplating your own mortality and what happens when you die, or people that you really love and cherish and their deaths. People struggle with that too. But yeah, I don't know. It's That's the fascinating aspect of life that we all seem to struggle with, and we all try to reconcile it in different ways. But yeah, so what do you then offer to the patients then when they're struggling with it? Like, how do you help them make sense of it, considering your own, like you say, you're agnostic, so there is a limitation on what you put to it as
If
well.
somebody's grieving, if they're not spiritual or not religious, then we just go through a typical emotional path of trying to do look at unfinished business, like whatever, because grief is so much
Mhm,
about all the hopes that you had with this person or things that you didn't get to say to them. So we go through all of that. So
mhm,
it's more of a mental, emotional experience
yeah,
rather than a spiritual, which I think which is valid because
mhm,
even if you are a spiritual person, you have to
right,
go through the mental and emotional stuff too anyway. Yeah.
yeah,
It's just that it's more
absolutely,
final for the people who are atheists because then it feels hopeless to them because there's no connection. You're dead, right? But
mhm,
if you have some kind of religious or spiritual belief, there's some kind of comfort in that. That oh, here's something, then maybe I'll be able to see this person again, and that's a nice feeling to have. I
yeah,
think.
yeah. But I think the cynics would argue that's almost like you're lying to
Totally.
yourself, or
Sometimes it's nice to lie to yourself. I look awful. I'm like, oh, I look great. You know what I mean? Like sometimes there's
yeah,
not all lies are bad. Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I think there's so another piece you touched on earlier, I wanted to come back to was finding the humor in these situations. And that can be
Yes.
tough, right, at times because it's not
Yep.
funny in the moment, but then looking back, you can look at it and chuckle about it if you have that sense of humor. But how have you been able to make light of some of your situations and how has that
Yeah.
helped?
So one thing is that I also just want to just start with a little bit is that part of me in the past was always made a joke out of everything, which is not. It's a coping mechanism, and it's a way to avoid pain. So there was that part too. And in terms of with emotional processing, how important it is to get real with your feelings. And because during these moments, it's not funny at all. When you're processing grief, not funny. So I think there's a time and a place for
Mhm,
humor and laughter. But yeah, looking back at it,
mhm.
I think it was great for me to write this memoir because I try to reflect on it with as much humor as possible, and I just threw funny things, and that really helped me to just add some fluff, lightness, laugh at myself.
Yeah,
Because otherwise, you're just in there in the
absolutely.
darkness, in the hole. And I think the laughter was like a little, like a little say, what is it? Like a little ladder or something that takes you up higher and hot air,
Yeah,
whatever you like. It creates elevation, I think, energetically.
yeah, yeah, for sure. So how have you been then what's the how have you made light of it? What's the humorous part about all of that from your perspective that's
For example, because my mum was actually a really funny person. Through the story, I would tell
Mhm,
all these like little silly little stories that I would remember her through these stories that she had told me growing up. And so that
mhm,
was nice, remembering her in that way, as well as, of course, I don't want to be Pollyanna Anna about the whole situation because there were some times which were not
yeah,
so great too. Life is a mixed bag, and to kind of see it for what it is, and but then throw in some pepper in some humor. I don't know. gives a little extra seasoning and
Yeah.
flavoring. It's definitely more rich, I think, the life experience when you get from all these different emotional angles. Sorry, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, I was just curious in terms of if there's any specific examples you could share with us that would help us get more context around some of that
Trying to
too.
think, like in the story itself, so most of it's so embarrassing. Like it's yeah, and my
Yeah.
book is it's really it's so personal and it's so incredibly raw and embarrassing because I'm really sharing some of the most lowest times in my life when I'm crawling and in that hole and not able to get out of it.
Yeah.
And so I'm sharing a lot of that stuff, but I'm trying to think of some of the fun. I don't know if it's even appropriate to share on your show, like some of the stuff that I wrote about, but I mean, it's so embarrassing. You know what I mean? I
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's
very out
already
there.
out there,
It's
right? In the
all
book.
right. I'll share this one funny story, but I can't remember when exactly it was in the book. Oh, like towards the end of life, people often lose bowel function. It just you
Mhm.
start losing function. So there was that whole experience that
Mhm.
happened, and so I just tossed in a funny story about my mom telling me when she lost bowel function. She was having like in Japan, they when they get a colonoscopy done in Japan, you're actually fully awake. And like in the States, they put you under and you don't remember anything. But in
Yeah.
Japan, I don't know why they do this in Japan. They don't like anesthesia. And you know why? I understand why. So, yeah,
Yeah.
but they really don't like anesthesia. So they did all the they prepped her, and then the doctor said she's in a gown. She's a gown, and she's in the gown has a huge hole in it, and her bum sticking out of the hole, and she's like in this room with her butt hanging out. And the doctor says, "Would you mind if a few interns come and observe the procedure?" And she was like mortified, but she knows she's polite in Japanese, and she's like, "Oh, okay, it's fine, it's fine,
Yeah.
fine." And so 20 people come into the room and she's hanging out with her butt to the audience. And anyway, so they do the whole
Yeah.
with a colonoscopy. They pump you up with air, right? They pump you up with so that
Yeah.
the camera can go in. Did the whole process, and they whip out the camera, and the doctor says there's going to be a little bit of gas that comes out, and she was like trying to control it. And she said that she had this a minute long fart, and it just kept going and going. Anyway, so I talk about it's just stuff like that. So my mom's telling I wasn't there
Yeah.
obviously, but she would tell me these stories.
Yeah.
Funny, you know what I mean? So this is I like to remember mom.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and that was what I was gonna would have been my next question also is it does bring to light her personality, and often we when we're stuck in grief, we're so stuck with the loss of the person, but we lose sight of some of those amazing qualities that those individuals had and some of those stories that made us laugh or we were able to build memories on. So that was my point there. I think as you were sharing that story is you're able to focus on some of those things as well and not just focus on the grief and the loss, but some of those memories that you guys created together, and whether it was her sharing her own stories or just in terms of the conversations you would have with
Absolutely,
her.
and this is something that I work with my patients too, and is to think about the diverse memories that we have, so we again don't get stuck in the hole of that just the pain, and we can start thinking about some of the positive memories because I think that those memories are alive, and even though after people pass away, our relationship with the person that has passed on still evolves. It's such a strange thing, right? They're not here anymore, but we can go through phases when we have good relationships with those that are passed, and we go through rough times too. It's like the
Mhm.
strangest thing, I think.
Yeah. I think it's just what I've come to understand myself is it's how we perceive time. And if you look at time as this relative thing, then it does make sense because things do evolve. Even though this person isn't physically here, there's still, as time progresses, there's still
Oh,
something happening
absolutely.
there that we're tied to,
Yes,
and it's not
yes.
emergent.
And we evolve when we see things from a different perspective. And I think then our relationship with that person
Hmm.
changes too. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating how it works. And just that humor piece, I think a lot of people can feel there's when it comes to grief, humor doesn't really fit in, and there's a lot of shame and judgment
Yeah.
around humor too. And I think I've experienced it too as young when I was younger. I had a friend whose dad had passed away, and the next day we were all like
Yeah.
laughing and having fun. And part of me felt shame and guilt that his dad just passed away and we're all joking around. But as I've grown older and look back on it, there's a reason why we are able to experience humor and why it's such a
Yeah.
part of us, right? And I often look at stand-up comedians, they're basically telling a story, but we're all waiting for that punchline where we can laugh, but we're so engaged in it and following along. And it's just made me think a lot about why did we evolve as a species and why humor is something we've also taken with us, because it is interesting, right? And it does serve a
I
profound
think so.
purpose.
And yeah, guys, like the neurotransmitters, it changes brain chemistry. And I think it's super
Mhm.
important for us to not be in a state of laughter all the time because that's also not great either. But to experience in like in condiment style, have little bits here and there. I think it's helpful.
Yeah, but it helps, right? There's times where, for example, if I'm not having a great day, a
Oh
joke
my
can go a
gosh.
long way, and just being able to experience humor or watch someone else be humorous or tell a joke can help,
Yes,
right?
agree.
And
Yeah, one of my friends, I have a really close friend and who I share especially if I'm in a really dark spot, I'll just usually reach out to her and we'll talk it out. And she'll often say, if I'm going really down a dark place, she'll say to me, "Go watch something funny." And I'm like, "Oh yeah," because when you're like in
Mhm.
that darkness, you forget about all the coping mechanisms. You just the darkness, and you sometimes you need somebody like an idea and to shift the energy out. But then she usually always tells me that, and I was like, "Oh okay." Like, I'm gonna go watch some bloopers or something silly. So it shakes up the for sure.
Yeah, yes, for sure, for sure. Yeah. And I think that there's that aspect too, right? Like you touched on being in those holes and how do you crawl out? And I think humor can serve
Totally.
that purpose too. And it's funny, right? Like the whole idea of bloopers too. We're laughing at someone else's mistakes. So we're finding humor in that too. And otherwise life can be pretty serious and things can be difficult if we take things too
I
seriously
think
as
so
well.
too. And when we're also get really serious and like stuck in this thought that your brain is not expanding either. You're literally just
Hmm.
going back and forth in the same groove. If that makes, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. But it's not. There's not a whole lot of expansion
Yeah.
that's going on in the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think when you even think about when I look at it, even in some of the scriptures or religion, there's still a lot of humor there and irony in a lot of those situations when you think about it, and you can make light of it. Obviously, people do make jokes based on religion too, and they are funny at times. But again, some people take it very seriously,
They do.
and that doesn't
Yeah,
help.
some people, as
Yeah,
you said, find humor inappropriate. Like I've had people who have just
yeah,
told me they just don't think that I'm funny. That's fine. Then not
yeah,
everybody needs to find my humor funny, or they just don't think it's appropriate to be funny at all. But there are some people like that,
yeah,
and that's fine. Maybe their brain must
yeah.
work in a very different way from mine.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. You can't appeal to everyone, and that's fine too. And having that confidence and being okay with it shows a lot of growth
Yes.
as
Yeah,
well,
that's something that
right?
I think naturally happens to most people once we start hitting and going into our 40s. I find that like the self acceptance and just being more comfortable in our own skin. That's very difficult to do, have self acceptance when we're younger. Like during the teenage years
Mhm.
and in our 20s, it's so much, our energy is so much focused on what other people think about us. And as we get older, we care less, I think.
Yeah. It depends, right? It's all
Sure.
individual specific. Some people care more, but I do agree when you're younger, you're in that exploration phase where you're just trying to figure out not only the world, but how do you fit into it? And you look for information all around you to see, hey, how
Yes.
do I
Yes.
show up? And does this situation make me feel good? And do people accept me here? And do people reject me here? And often we tend to put on masks, and unfortunately that can cause issues too when you're trying to, and that's where people fall into people pleasing as well. But it is a bit of an exploration. And then to your point, as you get older, you realize that it's just
Yeah, that you
exhausting.
mean the
You're never going to
yes,
satisfy.
absolutely
Yeah.
like changing masks and hats, and then you realize, oh,
Yeah.
I what? I need a mask. I don't need a hat or whatever the metaphor is. And then it gets much
Yeah.
lighter. I think it's just easier when you can just
Hmm.
be you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it, to something you touched on earlier, comes from this recognition, perhaps, that life is
Yeah.
too short. So you could live it seriously, or you can try to live it to appease others. But if it's truly short, and on your deathbed, are you going to, what kind of regrets do you want to have? Do you want to have regrets because you didn't live your full authentic life and you took it too seriously? Or you want to look back and say, hey, I lived it to the best as I could, and I enjoyed most most of it and made light of all the situations I could. That can go a long way
Absolutely,
too.
because I think at the end of life, saying to yourself, wow, I'm so happy about other people's opinions and I live somebody else's life. I don't think many people are going to say that. I think that I hope at least, because who knows, because have obviously not died yet. I haven't actually been on my actual deathbed, even though I thought that I was when I was in quarantine, but
Hmm.
I'm not quite there yet. And so
Hmm.
that at least this is what I hope
Hmm.
that I'm gonna feel or think when I'm there, because maybe
Yeah.
something random will come up. You know what I mean? I wonder if
Yeah.
anybody's done a study. Actually, there was that person that did a study on it was like an international study about what people are thinking on their deathbed. Did you read about this? It was
Hmm.
fascinating. And yeah,
No.
and there were two consistent things that kept coming up, he said, and it was about not spending enough time with people that they loved and not relating to the world. And that international, multicultural phenomena that he had found with these were the two regrets that people had. And when I read about this, I thought, you know what? I'm going to take this to heart. I'm going to relate to the world. I'm going to spend time with the people that I care about. And then also to tell them how I care about them too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crucial. And I can see truth to it, right? Because a lot of the times people will end up spending a lot of
Yeah.
time working, or, and when you're working, maybe you're not spending time with the people you really love and care for. So that goes a long way. And yeah, not being able to relate to the world, whether it's because you're too much in your head or you're taking things too seriously, that can affect you too, right? And
Absolutely. And he actually
yeah.
talked about this work situation. He said there was not one person that he talked to who was dying that said, I wish I spent more time in the office. Not one. Yeah. Work's nice and
Yeah.
all. It's fun, but not for everyone, right? For me, it is, but not for everybody. I feel very lucky that
Right.
I have a job that I like doing. And
Yeah.
that's one.
Yeah. That
Yes. Yeah.
goes a long
Yeah.
way.
I'm sure you can relate to that. Connecting with people
Hmm.
and having meaningful connections, I think goes a long way.
Hmm. For sure. Absolutely. Momoko, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you sharing your story, walking us through what's allowed you to navigate some of those difficult situations, how you've been able to deal with adversity and make light of some of those situations as well. And like you said, it's not always straightforward. It's not always You're not always making forward progress. Sometimes you do recede, sometimes you regress, you take steps back. Sometimes you've dug a bigger hole and you have to crawl out of that too. And I appreciate that because that is what life is, right? And if we focus on the fact that, hey, I've dug this big hole and now I can't get out of it, that's when we basically hold ourselves back. We tend to regress even more or we become stagnant, as you touched on. But it's all a journey, right? There's no one destination. And if we get fixated on the destination, then we get stuck as well. So it's navigating all of it. And perhaps at times it's just looking at what's immediately in front of you. What can you do in the present moment? How can you make the most of it? And that's where I think humor can play a huge role, where you're able to laugh at yourself because that shows growth as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you were saying, not to think too much about where you're going and staying in the moment, I think is crucial because then you get stuck on some
Mhm,
fantasy of what's going to be. Like learning how to enjoy the journey and where we are and the next step that we're
mhm.
taking.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much. I know you shared a little bit about your book. What are some ways listeners can find your work? And if they wanted to reach out to you, what are some ways they can do
So
that as well?
my writing website is momokowrites.com and my medical
Mhm,
website is omniwellnessnyc.com. And there are ways that people can reach out to me by either of those sites. And my books, I have two books, and they're available on Amazon.
awesome. We'll put all of that in the show notes, but
Thank
thank you
you.
again for this
A lot of
conversation.
fun, delightful conversation. Appreciate your time.